From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I think that Trump has served as a great president. One slight criticism I have is that he didn't protect his people enough. He didn't protect Mike Flynn enough, and others who went to work for him and believe in his agenda. They did not get the protection they need. I believe that lesson's been learned.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That was Adam Levinger, Vice President for Strategic Affairs at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, and also the author of the recent book, The Insider Threat: How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. We'll talk in depth with Adam today about that new book, The Insider Threat. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Scott, for having me. Real pleasure.
Also, former Senior Director for Strategic Assessments with the U.S. National Security Council. So there are insider thoughts from a guy who did serve on the inside. The Deep State's right there in the subtitle of the book, Adam. And this is a conversation about the administrative state, the deep state that stretches back, I suppose, nearly a decade in public discourse at this point. But I think it still is helpful for us to define at least what you mean when you say that. What is the deep state? What kind of office holder ends up composing it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it because I do think it's really important, particularly for those who are talking about the deep state and writing about it and discussing really its character, to not paint the deep state with too broad a brush, because then people start thinking that, well, you're just everything's a deep state, and there are some people who've written books that sort of equate the deep state with the administrative state, and I believe they're very different. So for my book, Scott, I've used a definition that I actually gleaned from the New York Times. And what I call the deep state in my book is a group of civilian and military officials inside the U.S. government who undermine our democracy from within. And so it's genuinely, it's a lawless operation. And, frankly, when before going into the Trump White House, I didn't think the deep state could exist. I thought that, surely any sort of, conspiracy of rogue individuals who, sought to, weaponize government, that would be checked and balanced by others in the federal government. But I learned over the course of my multi-year sort of battle with this deep state that there genuinely is I think, technically a criminal conspiracy, because they are subverting, federal processes intentionally. So it's a crime. Mm-hmm. But that they operate from like sort of key nodes within the national security, intelligence, and law enforcement bureaucracy. So it's by no means is the deep state all of these bureaucracies, but it's certain individuals operating from key nodes to sort of, control processes and weaponize processes. So that's really sort of the way I define the deep state. I think it's as more books come forward, for example, the excellent book by Lee Smith, The Plot Against the President, Mark Moyer's fabulous book, Masters of Corruption, and Ned Ryan's recent book, American Leviathan. I think that there are a lot of us who are seeing the same thing inside these bureaucracies, and it is just these particular actors are operating from key offices.
Are there particular agencies that you would argue exhibit more compromised conditions than others inside the U.S. government?
Oh, absolutely, and there's a real logic to this. So it's certainly the Department of Defense, and it's also our intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, but also the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the reason why is that, if you're going to create a criminal conspiracy inside the federal government to weaponize against your political rivals, you're going to want to really sort of take over key nodes within those agencies, because you have all these tools at your disposal. You have you can go to the FISA courts and spy on your political enemies, which is what happened in the 2016 presidential election, and there was a big scandal there. And also, Scott, there's if you're operating from these national security agencies, you can weaponize these insider threat policies. So you can say, well, I'm going to go after Adam Lovinger or Mike Flynn or Donald Trump as insider threats because I'm from the Department of Defense or the intelligence community, and I know that they're insider threats, and I have classified information. And so these more classified secretive agencies, they can also sort of use that cloak of secrecy to cover up their misconduct, to cover up their weaponization of federal process.
Adam Lovinger with us, his new book, The Insider Threat, How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. The various improprieties that you allege in the book, you talk about in the book, are not just misuses of internal executive branch systems. Tell us a bit about Stephen Luke and what happened to him.
Yeah, so Stephen Luke is, I'm sort of two minds in talking about Stephen Luke. So he was a federal whistleblower in the U.S. Department of Defense Inspector General's office. And what I've learned, Scott, over the years is that whistleblowers are really a strategic threat to the criminal conspiracy that I call the deep state. It's because they're insiders and they know what's going on. And so the last thing is that these deep state operatives want is for their internal schemes to become exposed. And Stephen Luke was a investigator of senior leader misconduct in the U.S. Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and he was reporting on senior leader misconduct to Senator Grassley's office. He's a very senior senator from Iowa, and famous as a whistleblower advocate. Mm-hmm. And Stephen Luke one day took an elevator down from his office at the Mark Center in Northern Virginia and crossed over a narrow bridge into a parking garage, a dimly lit parking garage, and was found later that day dead in the trunk of his car. And this was reported in the press as a suicide. I have received internal information, and my book reports this really for the first time, that this was determined to be a homicide, and that was by the Alexandria Police Department. That was then covered up, and a do-over investigation was done, and that was then sort of narrowed the scope of that investigation to only look at suicide as a possibility. And to this day, I think that most people who are aware of Stephen Luke having died are under the impression it was a suicide. But the evidence that I have that has since been confirmed by an attorney in the Alexandria city government is that this was a homicide that's been covered up. And as I said, I'm a little bit, I'm sort of two minds. On one hand, I think it's very important to raise this case of Stephen Luke and for this information to get out there, because it's really the logical endpoint to the corruption of these federal bureaucracies. I experienced, and as I lay out in my book, the facts in the law can be entirely ignored. Mm-hmm. And for me as a lawyer, this came as somewhat of a surprise. I assumed that at least one grouping of these federal officials would recognize that this criminal conspiracy, had to stop, but it didn't. And so, as our government gets increasingly lawless, and polls do show that Americans increasingly do feel that they're being ruled by a tyrannical, centralized bureaucracy, and it's true they are. I've seen it up close and personal, but eventually, murdering federal whistleblowers. And this is a very senior official. He was a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, and he was a senior investigator really on his way to, meeting yet again with Senator Grassley. And at least according to the official documents that have been confirmed, was murdered for it. And then it was covered up. And that really needs to be thoroughly investigated by Congress and the Department of Justice. But of course, on the other hand, it's like he also is a father and a husband. And just so you know, Scott, I've been in touch with his church, the family church, that's been reaching out to this family, preparing them, because this book, I don't want it to blindside them. But I do think that ultimately, when all the dust is settled, it's important for the truth to be told and for the true murderousness of the deep state to be exposed and fixed.
Adam Lovinger with us, his book, The Insider Threat, How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. Donald Trump, his first presidential term, had promised to weed out the deep state and to fight that fight from the Oval Office, from the executive branch. He gets another bite at the apple starting in 2025. What things should be on his agenda? How can the executive branch and the Oval Office fight against the deep state in Washington?
So that's a great question. And President Trump, really has learned quite a bit about the deep state, and I'm very pleased to see that he's unleashed he essentially wrote a 10-point sort of memorandum of the various things that the Trump 47 presidency will address regarding the deep state, and it's called President Trump's Plan to Dismantle the Deep State and Return Power to the American People. And he's really focusing on the right things. One thing in particular, Scott, that I'm very pleased he's looking at are the inspectors general. I mean, the inspectors general, and I would also say the United States Office of Special Counsel, which has as its mandate to protect whistleblowers, has been fully co-opted by the deep state, and really to do the opposite of what they were intended to do. The U.S. Office of Special Counsel, the inspectors general, their job is to root out the corruption within these federal bureaucracies and to protect whistleblowers. But they do precisely the opposite of that. They've been totally captured by this lawless bureaucracy. And, just looking at it from a sort of a constitutional perspective, these inspectors general, they're located within these federal executive agencies, and they're supposed to check and balance the very agencies that pay their salaries and pensions. And the founders of the United States, the framers of the U.S. Constitution, would find that arrangement to be absolutely preposterous. And, there may have been a time when these IGs, worked to a certain extent, but I've come across myriad government officials who have had their careers destroyed through lawless processes. They've gone to IGs and they've found that these IGs are just cover-up operations. And it's not me saying that. I mean, there's lots of government oversight entities, for example, the Project on Government Oversight, that issues report after report after report on just all of the abuses of these IGs. And I have to say, the murder of Stephen Luke took place on the DOD IG federal facility. So this was not in a public area. This was in a Department of Defense parking lot where this happened. So I wouldn't be surprised that after the Congress and the Department of Justice do their investigation, their real investigation of that murder, that they will find that there are IG operatives, who are responsible for killing their colleague. So, I think that Trump's on the right path with dismantling these IGs and preferably being true to our constitutional order and transferring that oversight function to Congress where it belongs.
Adam Lovinger with us, his book, The Insider Threat, How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. I want to ask about some of the foreign policy implications of things that are discussed throughout the book. Toward the end of the nuclear Iran chapter, you reference President Ronald Reagan's foreign policy and this forward strategy that he had. Would you advocate a return to the Reagan footing on the global stage?
So I do think that America's foreign policy should reflect, the overall interests of the American people. And President Trump has a very distinguished foreign policy record. He did extraordinary things with the Abraham Accords. He took on China in a way that no American president has ever done. And he really deterred Russia. I mean, it's important to note that during Trump 45, there were no wars, no wars of significance. And that's because Trump, like Reagan, leads from a position of strength. And America's adversaries fear Trump as they feared Reagan. They certainly did not fear Barack Obama or Joe Biden. In many respects, they thought that they were working for them. And sadly, as I lay out in my book, in many cases, they were working for America's enemies. So I think that, certainly we can't have a return to America being an active world's policeman. That's not why the American people elected Donald Trump the second time. But they did elect him to project strength and to, really, keep the peace through strength. And I guess in some respects, it's a further iteration of Teddy Roosevelt's view, which is you speak softly and you carry a big stick. Trump is certainly about carrying a big stick and projecting the resolve that we need to deter our enemies.
I did want to ask about that too, that the big stick, as you reference, or the idea that the U.S. can project strength while still retaining the Trump promises of keeping us out of foreign wars as much as possible. How does that occur, in the sense that if there's a military buildup or some sort of show of force, it's going to be an increase in DoD budgets. It's going to mean more contracts with defense contractors. Are they also part of the deep state? Are they involved in this I guess web that you outline? And could we trust that to be executed plainly and accurately?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and certainly, I mean, one thing that is important to keep in mind is that really throughout America's history, it's not the U.S. government that's necessarily been making weapons of war that we've used, but it's the U.S. government contracting with the private sector to produce these things, and that can be done properly. There are many examples throughout history that shows that can be done properly. One of the problems, though, is that there's been so much sort of incestuousness. I mean, obviously, Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex. Other people talk about the Iron Triangle, which was, the administrative state, dealing with defense contractors and then dealing with members of Congress. And so the defense contractors, contribute to the reelection of members of Congress, and members of Congress allow the administrative state to do whatever they want and to, be corrupt. And, that is something that Trump has really shined a spotlight on in a way that I don't think any American president in history has done. I mean, he does talk about draining the swamp. He is very clear about, that this is a very corrupt process. That said, no one wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater. America does need to retain its preeminence, its military primacy, and that can be done. But we do need to hold these defense contractors, these contractors accountable. We need to hold the officials that are within the government, the contracting officers that have been corrupt. I'll tell you, one of the conversations I had with General Mike Flynn soon before he became National Security Advisor is that, when he was at the Defense Intelligence Agency, when he first arrived at DIA to be its director, he asked the DODIG for 10 years of audits of, how the DIA has managed its programs, and not one single audit came back clean, meaning that every single one of them showed extensive fraud, waste, and abuse. And there needs to be some leadership to clean that out. And I do think that Trump has the will to do that. He needs insiders who know how to do that, who can help him with that. So he has the vital outsider's perspective. Unlike so many American presidents who've come into office, he's not a creature of Washington. He hasn't been bought by what I call the deep state, but he's a genuine outsider, even after having already served as president. But I do think that he knows what the problem is, and he needs insiders to help him clean out these Augean stables.
Okay. Great transition, because my last question for you is on that exact point, which is you've written this great book, The Insider Threat. You mentioned previously Mark Moyer, who's written a great book called Masters of Corruption. You guys are both on the outside now for various reasons. What needs to be done to attract and then retain the kind of people to be on the inside and work from the inside to root out these problems?
Yeah, so that's actually something I've been thinking a lot about and really working professionally for the past couple of years, and that is to really have sort of a deep state counter strategy. And what I mean by that, the reason why that's so important is that Donald Trump was a whistleblower. He recognized that there was a swamp that needed to be drained. He identified it. Mike Flynn was a whistleblower. He identified that there was a lot of corruption within the IC and the intelligence community needed to be reformed. I'm a whistleblower. But what happens is that whistleblowers, as most tragically, the case of Stephen Luke shows, really get taken out. And so there needs to be some protection of the people who are going to take on the hard fights, who are going to stand up to corrupt government officials who have been lining the pockets of contractors for years. So there needs to be sort of a protective cocoon, and that needs to really come from the top. I think that Trump has served as a great president. One slight criticism I have is that he didn't protect his people enough. He didn't protect Mike Flynn enough, and others who went to work for him and believe in his agenda. They did not get the protection they need. I believe that lesson's been learned, and that now from the very top of the White House, from the president himself, that he will be protecting his people so that they can go to battle with this lawless criminal enterprise called the Deep State.
Adam Levinger is a former senior director for strategic assessments at the U.S. National Security Council, current vice president for strategic affairs at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, and his new book is The Insider Threat: How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. Adam, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
My pleasure.
Up next, Dr. Timothy McDonnell returns. He is director of sacred music here at Hillsdale College. We'll take a look at another beloved Christmas carol, this time Good King Wenceslas. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to find us on X. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined by Dr. Timothy McDonnell. He is Associate Professor of Music and Director of Sacred Music here at Hillsdale College. Dr. McDonnell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We continue our walk through a few selected Christmas carols, and today we talk about Good King Wenceslas. Tell us a bit about the history surrounding this carol and what inspired its composition.
Well, in a way, Good King Wenceslas is perhaps among the more quirky of the carols that are really part of the standard canon of carols. It's unique because it doesn't tell in any way the story of the coming of Christ or the coming of the Messiah, and yet it still has an absolute attachment to the season. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. And I think it was sort of engineered by the hymnographer John Mason Neal, who wrote the carol. And it first appears in 1853 in a collection called Carols for Christmastide that John Mason Neal put together with the help of his editor, Thomas Helmore, who's also a well-known hymnographer. And it's interesting because it's based on a poem in Czech about the Bohemian Duke Wenceslas, who lived in the 10th century, around 907 to 935. He didn't live very long, but in his short life, he was known for his tremendous charity as a nobleman, and it was a very difficult life. You know, he eventually is assassinated by his brother, so you can imagine what his circumstances on a regular basis were like. But the hymn itself, it basically paints a narrative. It's a 5-verse setting. It's, of course, a poem. All hymns start their lives as poems. And it talks about how Wenceslas looks out and sees a poor man gathering wood for a modest fire in the cold of winter, and how Wenceslas, sort of Don Quixote-like, summons his page to begin the project of seeing to the welfare of his very poor subject as the Duke, right? And so he summons the page. They gather some food, and they're going to travel through the deep snow on foot to whatever hovel this person lives in. And it's a rather fraught journey, it turns out. And the page is seeking. He's basically, it's the classic thing where the page is the voice of reason. Like, really, should we continue? The weather's terrible, and I can't find my footsteps. And Wenceslas says, no, just step where I'm stepping. And and the page says, oh, the ground is warmed. This isn't the original Czech poem. It's actually it's much more elaborate in the Czech poem. And John Mason Neal does a fabulous job of condensing it into verse. And, finally, you get this sort of point where at the end it says, therefore Christian men be sure wealth or rank possessing, ye who now will bless the poor shall yourselves find blessing. This is the message of this carol, really. And why is it associated with Christmas? Well, John Mason Neal on his own said that Good King Wenceslas looked out on the Feast of Stephen, which happens to fall on December 26th, the day after Christmas. And so that one ingenious inclusion makes it forever associated with that particular Christmas week. And so I think it's also important to point out that, why would this carol have emerged at this time? So we're thinking about the middle of the 19th century. There are a couple of streams, I think, that influenced this project of Neal's. First of all, at this point in time, you've got this sort of, it's the Victorian era, but it's also the Dickensian era. And so the social gospel becomes, especially with the First and Second Great Awakenings, the developments of a certain evangelical spirit in England, for instance, and certainly, stories like The Christmas Carol by Dickens. There's a real heightening of this aspect of Christian piety. And Neal himself, interestingly enough, worked as his job as an Anglican priest was to be the warden of something called Sackville College, which is basically, it's not a college in our sense like Hillsdale College, but it was a college or a kind of residence for the poor and the indigent. So it was a poorhouse. It was an almshouse, as they call it in England. And so Neil's job was to literally take care of the poorest people in his environs in this Sussex area of the Sackville College. And so his own life was kind of wrapped up with this idea of, of service. And particularly in the case of Sackville, is the Earl of Dorset was the Sackville family, and he established this almshouse as a nobleman. So in a way, he was living a kind of the extended generosity of this 17th century nobleman, sort of reflecting a little bit of Wenceslas's own story in that way.
How would you describe the way the words and the melody come together in this particular carol?
Well, like so many things, it's an accidental conjunction between the words and the music, because the words were cast in verse, and of course that has a certain amount of predictability about it. And so these verses can fit many different melodies. And the melody that Neil found was actually delivered to him by the British ambassador to Sweden in a book called Pie Canciones, which was first published way back in 1582, about 300 years before Neil's time. And it was a wonderful collection of basically medieval melodies and Latin texts that were used in schools in the Swedish-speaking part of Finland. It's interesting. It was a Protestant schoolmaster and a Catholic publisher who kind of worked together to produce this collection. But Neil's copy that he got from the British ambassador to Sweden was the first for that collection to appear. Many interesting tunes, including Gaudete and several other important Puer Natus Nobis. Are from that collection. And so it was kind of a new collection. The tune that he took was melody to a text called Tempus Adest Floridum. So the season for flowering is upon us. So from that you can gather this is not a winter theme in the original text for the melody, but in fact it was an Easter springtide carol. And so he borrows this melody, which is very particular. Good King Wenceslas looked out. That ba 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 ba. That repeated melody gives it a sort of a folky character. It's got a character that is also joyful, and so you hear a little bit of that Easter joy is still kind of embedded in the melody, and so but it fits perfectly with the tune. I can say that in terms of its the synchrony between tune and text, I think is really the selection of that tune, which was very purposeful. Sometimes carols are moved around. Like, for example, O Little Town of Bethlehem. The British sing a completely different melody than the one that we know, which was the original melody. Our melody was the original one because it's an American carol. But this choice on the part of Neil was really quite purposeful, and I think it's a brilliant pairing.
Talking with Dr. Timothy McDonnell about Good King Wenceslas as we go through some of our Christmas carols. The theme here clearly is one of charity. Is this an example of having these carols taking this Christian message to a wider audience, to a more mass audience?
I think so, and I think that the history of this particular carol in terms of its popularity is evidence of that. It emerged, the Dickensian Victorian angle of the social gospel is one aspect of it, but there's also the influence of the Oxford movement in the Church of England, where there was a romance about these ancient histories of saints, this hagiography. And Neil was very interested in recapturing some of those stories, and he made them. He actually had a children's book it was kind of almost like a book of the virtues, where the stories of these ancient saints and these people from long ago and their rather illustrious deeds in the name of their Christian belief became morals, almost like Aesop's fables in a secular or a pagan sense. And so I think Neil was definitely trying to create a moral or a kind of a parable of charity here. And initially this hymn, when it was sort of after the first couple generations in the early 20th century, it was derided as doggerel nonsense kind of caroling. What is this even about? Percy Granger said that it's a sloppy and clumsy and ill-organized narrative. And he said he'd hoped that it would just disappear from the repertoire. So there was this, and it's funny, these predictions are really are kind of amusing to watch in hindsight. But in fact, it has remained popular, and maybe more than a lot of Christmas carols, its life has extended to other audiences because people like Count Basie end up recording this. It becomes almost a jazz standard in a couple of cases, and that new, like, think about the fact that the melody originates probably like in the 14th century and then ends up in the Count Basie band. That's a pretty amazing second or third or fourth life for something of this sort. So I do think it's had a wide-ranging influence.
From a compositional perspective, what does make it so unique that perhaps it has hung on all these years?
Well, I think the tune is just the dance-like character of the tune. It's jaunty. It's kind of got a kind of almost, you can hear Wenceslas and his page plodding through the snow with those repeated notes, and it's got a kind of a ruggedness about it, and a jolliness at the same time. And I think that those two characters of the melody plus the continuous attachment to the story, like what exactly is happening here. You actually can't really make it out in the first verse. In fact, the first verse is, by itself, which most people probably could sing by heart, is not enough to even get the premise. You really have to go through the story that the hymn is telling you. And so one of the programming challenges of this would be let's say you could program it in church, like say on December 26th, if people happen to be in church, you'd have to do the whole hymn because otherwise you don't get the story. And so that might be a challenge, but that has made it a kind of sort of a meta carol almost of the Christmas season. And why people like these jazz greats who've sung it, or Bing Crosby, or any of these other popular musicians, they've probably made more out of it than anyone in church ever did for this reason.
Dr. Timothy McDonnell, he is Associate Professor of Music and Director of Sacred Music here at Hillsdale College as we discuss Good King Wenceslas. Dr. McDonnell, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, Dr. Pat Bart returns again. We continue our lengthy conversation, an interesting conversation, into the history of the English language. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
We're back on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. We're joined by Dr. Pat Bart. She is Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College and also a familiar voice on the show as we've been digging through our conversation into the history of the English language. This is part 4 You can find all 3 previous parts in the archive, podcast.hillsdale.edu, or wherever you get your audio. We left off last time as English was kind of ebbing and flowing into use in various parts of Europe. Dr. Bart, what other languages remained in use as English was starting to gain a foothold?
For well over 200 years, almost 300 years after the Norman Conquest, English takes a back seat to Latin, in the church, very much so, as it's the preeminent scholarly language of England. So even if you're not writing about theology, you're still going to write about it in Latin. I mean, this goes on into Newton writes his Principia Mathematica in Latin, right? Okay, so Latin has this overall prestige that English had almost sort of begun to come up to. I'm not saying it ever got there, but it was definitely on its way, right? That gets knocked back. And then the language of power and wealth, of course, is the Norman dialect of French for those same almost 300 years. So that era between 1066 and 1350, when an enormous vocabulary of Romance words, whether from Latin or French, it came into tens of thousands of words, came into English. Not just, I would say, this sort of famous beef versus pork and steer versus swine of the Saxon dogs or whatever. Not just those words, but just words that today, in trying to translate something like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or the Gettysburg Address into English that does not have Romance influences in it, is not only... It's fun and it's quaint looking, but it's like irritating. It's really just, oh, come on. Give me my French, man. I just want my French back, And this is somebody who doesn't really speak French that well, but, right? But it's just the word Constitution itself, right, is from Latin/French, right? So that's how it came in. Not entirely from the Norman invasion, but strongly from the Norman invasion.
Talking with Dr. Pat Bart about the history of the English language. The next big event that we need to talk about is the Black Death around 1350. What's the result of all that death?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So in spite of what Monty Python says in the Holy Grail, right, where you've got the bring out your dead or whatever. Okay. So the Black Death actually reached England in 1348. So almost around 1350, right? Not 850 years earlier, which is when King Arthur would be. So anyway, many changes resulted from this plague. The death rates in colleges and law courts, which you think, well, law courts, but in both colleges and law courts, the judges and the Oxford and Cambridge dons, they lived in really close proximity to one another. Okay, monasteries as well, decimated. In the modern sense of that term, okay? So, 90% of the people die. Well, can you imagine? May God forbid, but what if 90% of us faculty at the colleges died, within a year or two? Oh, okay, quick, we need a faculty. We also need students, Maybe we'll lower some standards here for a while. I don't know. Okay, so what happened was, for example, a really prime example is that the law courts began to allow pleading in English. Okay, because, maybe all the lawyers are dead, but where's the clerks? But they don't know as much Latin and French. They know some, they know a lot, but they don't. And they're allowed to step up because there just aren't any Norman descended people left, right? You're at the top of the pyramid. If 10% of you die, or 20, or 30, or 90% of you die, then that's huge compared to a lot of us Saxons died, but there's still a whole lot of us left, right? And so that really kind of churned it churned the power structure, it churned the wealth structure, and hence it also churned the language structure of the country. This is a time of Geoffrey Chaucer, and it's often not recognized that his family began to rise to prominence because his branch of the Chaucer family inherited the wealth of everybody who died off in their family. And he and his immediate family happened to be the ones who didn't die from the plague. Okay, so, that really was an important part of his rise to his father became a vintner instead of a Chaucer is a shoemaker, right? So he's Jeff Shoemaker, actually. And they became vintners, and then that got them in with the king and John of Gaunt, and there's the story, right? The rise. His granddaughter becomes a duchess. All right, so it's partly due to the Black Death.
Around this time, 13th, 14th century, we see a deterioration in the use of French. Why is that?
Well, as so often, there's more than one reason, right? So the kings of England lost Normandy. They kept fighting over it, but they lost it in 1204. Okay, so 1066, you come crashing over from Normandy, and then and that's your duchy, and now you're the kings of England and the dukes of Normandy, and then suddenly you keep calling yourselves the dukes of Normandy, but now somebody else is taking it over. Oopsies. Okay, so you don't go back there as often or as readily, right? And I don't know about you, but when you visit, if you get to visit a place often where they speak a certain foreign language, you buff it up every single time, right? And then if suddenly you just can't go there for 10 years, well, you get kind of rusty. The Dutch are always so proud of how many languages they speak, but good grief. 10 minutes away, they've got whatever. So and on their TV, it's just, right?
Yeah.
And so that contact, right, became lesser and lesser. And it became a serious vacation trip, if you will, in modern terms, rather than, I think I'm going to, Paris for the weekend or something. No, it became a really difficult journey where you were considered to be the outsiders, right? We actually find over the course of several generations that there begin to be surviving French grammars written in England, English-based, right? So that, grandma speaks perfectly good French. And she just doesn't understand why the grandchildren, what are they speaking this disgusting Saxon dog language, Like, I wish they would stop speaking that in the house. It's just inappropriate, right? And so then the kids get sent off to learn it. And, of course, they hate that. Right. And does this sound familiar? Right. And it's sort of like having to learn the piano or something. It's like, why do I have to learn the piano? And if you live somewhere where everybody learned the piano, you might not be as hostile to it. But these kids are not living where everybody speaks French anymore. Right. It just gradually ebbs. Right. The Black Death also, as mentioned, played an important role. But then there was also the 100 Years' War. Okay. This is where the English are trying to get France back. At the height of it, the English kings not only were the Dukes of Normandy, but the Aquitaine, and a whole bunch of central and southern France was under their sway through marriage, right? So they're trying to get it back, and Henry V is spectacularly successful. He gets named the heir apparent to the French throne because he kind of whacked him real hard, But in the course of this, you almost think, all right, now that this has happened, these Normans are all going to get uppity again. They're all going to start speaking French again. They're all going to hang around in France. But no, the thing that happened was that the French were seen as the enemy, you see. And Henry V famously relied on his English bowmen, the longbowmen, right, to win those battles. And so it had just become, we English, and we English own France, man. We, but we own it as English, and so by that time, Henry V actually asserts his power, not by speaking French to the French king and having the treaty in French translated into Latin so everybody else knows it, but he starts using English as a diplomatic language. Yeah, dun dun dun. Right. So, so that's another important move there. Right. Law courts locally, but then English asserting itself as a diplomatic language, and it wouldn't really become fully a diplomatic language. Even in my youth, French was still, very much the diplomatic language. But people got real in the course of the 20th century, and English became the diplomatic language, right? So because more and more people just knew it,
right?
And do we have to learn French? I'm going crazy. I don't want to learn an extra one, right?
Dr. Pat Bart back for one more visit, part 5 of our History of the English Language, next time we chat. That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Adam Levinger, Tim McDonnell, and Pat Bart. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.